African landscapes have been captured in some of the most iconic images of our times. You know what I mean? The desolate beauty of the Sahara and Kalahari deserts, the lush emerald wealth of the Congo Basin, the looming mass of Tanzania's Mount Kilimanjaro, the impenetrable wall of South Africa's Drakensberg Mountains, the belch of lava from Mount Cameroon's eruptions, the gaping space of the Great Rift Valley of East Africa, wind cascading along the grass seas of the savannah, stretch upon stretch of near interrupted coastline, white sand, black sand, golden brown sand, no sand. To those in the know, however, the beauty of the African continent's majestic landscape is enlivened by the myths and legends associated with them. These stories, preserved in song and dance, in art both mundane and sacred, speaks volumes about how African people understand themselves and their place in the world. In the coming weeks, for the MA podcast, we will examine a sample of these myths and legends. But first, an introduction. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Tunde. This is not the first time we've talked about the connection between folklore and the land. Last year, we took a month-long journey across the continent, during which time we discovered the folklore associated with the Luera wetlands of Uganda, the Sahara Desert, and Kirinyaga or Mount Kenya. That was just a taste, a small sampling of what is available. As you can imagine, landscape-related myths and legends often intersect with creation myths. After all, the question of how us humans and everything else came to be continues to preoccupy human conjecture. For example, in the Creation Myths and Foundation Legends section of my just released book, the Watkins Book of African Folklore, I spent some time talking about the way caves and underground enclosures show up in African folklore. And as it turns out, a great many creation myths from all across the continent starts with humans emerging from a cave or some other such underground location, often near a river or a lake. And in my book, there is a story from the Kabyle of Algeria, the Tswana of Southern Africa, and the Mende of Sierra Leone. And so here's the part where I tell you to buy the book and read it, so buy the book and read it. Before we get carried away with the stories themselves, it is worth examining why it matters that we understand and appreciate the connection between folklore and geography, especially as concerns the landscape. And we talked about this last year when we did the series on folklore and place. The myths and folklore, indeed the very culture of a given people, emerges from their encounters with their natural environment, wherever on the planet they may be. And German geographer Karl A. Sinnhuber summarizes this relationship perfectly when he says geography is a study of places, but there are few places on earth which do not owe their present and past appearance and character to the interaction of nature and man. Thus, folklorists must maintain an awareness of geography if they are to fully understand the attitudes and beliefs and appreciate the cultural and spiritual forces which have been at work to make a people who they are. Simply put, when you study a people's myths and legends, you inevitably emerge with a better understanding of how their presence has impacted the land on which they live and how the land on which they live has shaped them in turn. And the best illustration I can think of for this would be the Ntanda pits of Uganda. The Ntanda pits are a grouping of over 200 deep holes in the ground in a forest near Mitiana district. And in the Baganda creation myth, Walumbe, a folkloric figure who is said to have brought disease and death into the world, stomps into the ground to create these holes so he could hide in them, away from the wrathful eyes of Kaikozi, the digger, another folkloric character sent by Golu, the supreme being, to hunt him down. People in the area around the Ntanda pits believe that the holes are entrances to the underworld. Archaeologists, however, believe that the Ntanda pits may have been iron mining pits or holes dug in the ground for storage by early inhabitants of the region. And unfortunately, the climate of that region and much of the African continent makes archaeological excavation next to impossible. So it's still not 100% clear what these pits were used for. And so studying the relationship between folklore and the land can yield deep insights about history, migration, and material culture. We also talked about this last year. Studying which folkloric accounts exist and tracing how variations of a specific folkloric account has spread over a given area and over time can reveal many things about how a place's geography has changed over time. So you can imagine a situation where in a myth, they talk about a river that used to run through a place, and then you go to that place and there is no river. It can also reveal much about migration patterns, and the items that show up in folklore can reveal much about the flora and fauna of the land, but also about trade and contact with other civilizations. For example, you might be surprised to hear that the much valued red coral, which is a marker of royalty among the Edo of Nigeria, was introduced to the Edo people by Portuguese traders in the 1400s. In Edo oral traditions, however, Oba Eware dove deep into the sea and traveled to the court of Olokun, owner of the sea. And when he met the deity, Olokun sat in a palace furnished with brass vessels and was dressed in a tall red coral helmet crown with a thick red collar of coral around his neck and intricately wrought red coral garments. And if you've seen a picture of an Oba of the Edo people in Nigeria, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. And so when Oba Eware returned to his people, he adopted Olokun's coral and brass paraphernalia as his own. Conversely, you might think that cocoa is grown in Europe based on the tradition of making chocolate hands in the Belgian city of Antwerp. However, that tradition emerged from an unfortunate intersection of Belgian folklore about a giant called Dron Antigoon and Belgium's colonial endeavors. And I'll put a link in the references that delves into this a little bit more. Above all, an appreciation for the link between folklore and the land it emerges from elevates the land to as important a place as the people who inhabit it. And this is a sensibility that I think us moderns could really do with, because this is precisely why we have cultural heritage sites. And as you may know, cultural heritage sites are sometimes pockets of the natural world which, due to the stories associated with them, will be left to evolve at their own pace with minimal human interference, which is a good thing. And so as we spend the next couple of weeks looking at landforms on the African continent and the legends associated with them, what I would like for each person to do is reflect on how your understanding of yourself or of the people that you come from, whether you're African or from any other part of the world, has been shaped by the geography of the places where you come from or where you have lived. And bonus points if you have a cool story to go with it. And so I will see you all next week. Thank you as always for listening.